The year is 1545. Roger Ascham's Toxophilus, an archery manual for the common man, has just been published. Early in his book he writes, "Yet, as I said before, no honest fletcher will be angry with me, seeing I do not teach how to make a shaft, which belongeth only to a good fletcher, but to know and handle a shaft which belongeth to an archer." What Ascham is saying here is simple, but important. He draws a clear line between the fletcher and the archer. The fletcher is the craftsman, the one with deep hands-on knowledge of how an arrow is truly made. The archer, on the other hand, is the user of that craft. But Ascham reminds us, even though an archer doesn't make arrows, they still need to understand them. They need to recognize what makes a shaft straight, true, and dependable, what makes one unworthy of their bow. It's a reminder that skill isn't just in shooting the arrow, it's knowing the quality of the arrow you choose. Life for a fletcher looked very different in Ascham's time. While bowyers shaped bows, fletchers made arrows, and arrows were still a matter of national importance. The longbow had carried England through the 100 Years' War only a century before, and laws still required men to practice archery on Sundays and holidays. This meant one thing: demand. To Ascham, the fletcher was the artisan, the keeper of a quiet, essential knowledge. Their life was humble, but their craft was vital to the kingdom. Today, though, things have changed. Archery is no longer tied to national defense. The fletcher's role has faded. Adding capitalism and modern manufacturing, and arrows have become a product, a commodity. Something you pull off a shelf like eggs or bread. Manufactured, versatile, consistent. Not necessarily bad things. Most innovation in archery is now driven by the hunting industry. A constant cycle of new and improved. A chase for more feet per second simply because we can. It's painted in camo and sold to the average archer as a necessity. Want a more reliable shot? Use these graphite arrows. Pair them with this AI-designed bow. I exaggerate, but not by much. If the new way was really that necessary, our ancestors would have starved. Since, they couldn't catch a deer with anything less than 300 feet per second and painted in camo. A grievance and an observation for another time, perhaps. And yet, somewhere in all that improvement, all the extra feet per second, the old ways still call to us. The question is, why? Why choose wooden arrows at all, when by their nature, they're inconsistent, varying in weight, straightness, spine, and nearly every other trait a true arrow depends on, especially when you compare them to the engineered precision of modern carbon shafts. Today's carbon arrows come with weight tolerances as tight as plus or minus 2 grains, giving archers beautifully matched sets that fly nearly identically. A good set of wooden arrows, by contrast, is usually matched within about plus or minus 5 grains. That means the lightest and heaviest arrows in the same dozen can differ by as much as 10 grains. 10 grains may not sound like much, but at distance, it's enough to show. In Olympic archery, that kind of spread is completely unacceptable. And even in traditional shooting, it can drop an arrow several inches at 30 to 40 yards. A couple of inches at that range would have been more than enough to cost Robin Hood his golden arrow. When I think of making arrows, it takes me all the way back to my youth. My first bow was several lashed together reeds, held together with packing tape and string. My first set of arrows were those same reeds, but trimmed and sharpened with cardboard cutouts for feathers. Needless to say, there was a lot to be desired, but it satiated the urge of a 10-year-old boy with the fascination of Robin Hood. My next attempt wasn't until several years later, where I had traded in my compound bow for a recurve. A simple stick and string. The catalyst for the decision to switch to a traditional style bow is a story for another time. I grabbed my new bow and some carbon arrows that I had from my compound bow and headed to the local range. Upon taking my first few shots with my new recurve, I discovered it felt empty, almost hollow. The bow was doing its job to send the arrow downrange, but that was it. I was surprised and puzzled at the feeling of emptiness. What was I missing? I decided that in order to feel more like Robin Hood, I needed to complete the transformation into a traditional archer. I needed to shoot handmade wooden arrows, like they did back in Ascham's time. I purchased a how-to video and looked over my collection of archery books to get an idea of what I was up against. There was no one I knew that could help me fulfill my desire to take a step back in time. I had to learn to make my own traditional wooden arrows. My first attempt was poor. Little more than a wooden dowel with some goose feathers glued on. No cresting, no crown, no 5-degree helical offset. And I'm pretty sure I used hot glue to hold the feathers on as well. But the arrows flew. They zigged and they zagged, dipped down and rose up, but they flew. I could not have been more proud. And that first shot, absolute magic. The carbon arrows didn't feel right. When you knocked them on the bow and they clinked against the wood, the pitch was too high. When you drew one from the quiver, the carbon was too cold to the touch. It wasn't right. That first wooden arrow, I took my first step back into the days of Robin. Arrow by arrow, set by set, I got better. All in the pursuit of chasing the feeling of that first shot. I broke just about every arrow I had made in that first set in a week. Learning to shoot in the old methods was more difficult than I had imagined, and at this rate, I could see how Fletchers paid their debts. I had to demand for more arrows. I seemed to have a need for a set every month for the first year of my practice. After some time, I settled into a rhythm. First set of the year in the spring, second set in the fall. When the first signs of spring have taken hold, and the warmth has just returned to the air, but not enough to firmly shake winter's grip from the breeze. When the sky is bright blue, the occasional cotton ball cloud floating lazily past. When there's a slight breeze, almost as if spring is trying to quietly usher winter out of its way. That is the perfect day to make arrows. I'd spend the morning brainstorming what the arrows looked like and pondered about the things that inspired me. Maybe a design inspired by Tolkien, or from a character Miyamoto designed. Maybe a spot-on replica of arrows used by the real experts of their day, Hill, Thompson, Pope, Bear, all great archers in their own right. It wasn't just the finished product for me, though. It was the smell of the Port Orford cedar when it was sanded and cut. It was the fight against the cup of coffee I had in the morning to steady my hand during cresting. The day the arrows were ready, it always seemed to be late in the afternoon. The sun was fighting to stay out later, and in the last dwindling light of the day, I get my first chance to try out the new set. I shoot until I couldn't see, and the fear of breaking one of my new arrows from a wayward shot was enough to coax me inside, build a cozy fire, and settle in with a bowl of homemade French onion soup, and perhaps a glass of wine. Fall arrows were different. It always seemed like you were racing against time. If you were a hunter, you wanted the arrows finished with enough time to get used to how they flew before the season started. The light seemed to be hurried out of the sky, gently reminding you of the impending cold and shorter days. But the smell of the cut cedar shafts mixed with the smell of drifting leaves in the wind and the chill in the air was always enough to bring a sense of excitement. It was a time of preparation for the winter, and making a set of arrows in the fall just felt like the right thing to do. Fall arrows required a bit more thought in their design. The greens, browns, and yellows I typically used did little to stand out in the leaf litter covering the ground. If you'd like to keep yourself busy for an afternoon, shoot a brown and yellow fletched arrow into a wooded area in early fall. I guarantee you'll be searching until spring. No, fall arrows had to be brightly colored. I've always tried to take my cues from nature when designing arrows, and when you're walking through the woods in the fall, in a slathering of faded browns, yellows, and greens, the blue jays and cardinals tend to stand out. Their bright blues and deep reds naturally attract the eye. These happen to be great colors for feathers on an arrow as well. White seems like a logical choice until you get your first solid snow on the ground. And since these arrows had to last through the winter until spring, I needed to give myself the best chance of not losing them in the winter snow. Ascham had his own opinions on feathers. In Toxophilus, he has Philologus interrupt Toxophil at one point, almost with a laugh, saying that many Fletchers, men who worked with feathers every day, could hardly explain what makes a feather good, and he urges him, "Let me hear you more at large express those things in a feather, the which you packed up in so narrow a room." Toxophil's response is that the only thing fit enough to be on an arrow shaft is a feather, because it's soft enough to give way to the bow as it's fired, and stiff enough to spring back after it's past the bow, giving stable flight. There are other considerations to crafting a well-rounded set of arrows. The weight of the arrow impacts how far and fast the arrow will fly, but it's also a consideration if you're hunting large or small game, or shooting for a competition at any sort of distance. The lighter the arrow, the less drop from a given draw weight of bow, or in other terms, how many pounds it takes to draw the bow back to 28 inches. The spine or flexibility of the arrow shaft is also a strong consideration and needs to be matched to the draw weight of the bow in order for the arrow to be considered tuned. The grain spacing and straightness also play a key role in how the arrow flies, and more importantly, how and if it breaks when you miss. What Ascham points out in the beginning is true, though. Individually, these attributes are the concern and consideration of the Fletcher, but only when they become a functioning arrow are they concern of the archer. The archer doesn't consider the individual weight or spine of an arrow, but they are concerned with whether the arrow flies true and feels tuned when coming off the bow. The archer has the final word on what arrow is shot and for what purpose. The knowledge that the archer has of the arrow is just that, of the arrow, whereas the knowledge the Fletcher has is of the individual parts that, in theory, should serve the purpose of the archer. I often found myself sitting at my workbench, trying to explain, even just to myself, why a certain feather feels right, or why one shaft sings cleanly off the bow while another wobbles just a hair. Why the smallest choices, color, spine, cut, grain, suddenly matter when you're the one that has to live with them. Fletching is meditative work, slow, precise, patient. Exactly what Ascham envisioned an archer's study of the arrow to be. So maybe I was wrong to assume that the person who knows the arrow best is the Fletcher. Perhaps it's the archer, the person who must send it downrange and answer for where it lands. And it was here, somewhere between the smell of cedar dust and the first chill winds of autumn, that the truth finally settled in. The old ways don't call to us because they're perfect. They call to us because they aren't perfect. And maybe that's the heart of it. Maybe that's why the old ways still whisper to us. A carbon arrow is perfect in a way that leaves nothing for the archer to do except shoot it. It asks nothing of you. It hides its nature behind tolerances and algorithms and tight mechanical certainty. But a wooden arrow is honest. It carries its imperfections right on the surface. A twist in the grain, a knot smothered out by a careful hand, a feather that hums just a little bit louder than the rest. And instead of being flaws, those things become innovations. They ask you to pay attention, to learn, to adjust, to meet the arrow halfway. Because what is there to work on when something is perfect? What is there to discover? Perfection gives you results. Imperfection gives you a relationship. And in that way, Ascham understood something we sometimes forget. He wasn't telling archers to become Fletchers. He was telling them to become students of the arrow, to read its small irregularities, to understand its character, to know why one shaft flies true while another wobbles, even when they look the same. 500 years later, and that's still what draws so many of us back to cedar and goosefeather. Not the accuracy, not the efficiency, but the chance to work with something living, something that teaches us as much as we shape it. The old ways are not perfect, but that's exactly why they endure. Because in their imperfections, we find room for ourselves.